What if the man who sentenced Jesus to death never believed he was guilty? What if the most famous act of judicial cowardice in all of human history was not the act of a cruel tyrant, but the act of a frightened administrator who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway? What if there existed a report? An official Roman document? A testimony written in the cold, precise language of imperial bureaucracy, describing those events from the perspective of the man who ordered the execution. A report sent to Rome, filed in the imperial archives, and then lost, destroyed, or deliberately buried when the empire that produced it became the empire that worshipped the man it had killed. Why does the Apostles' Creed, the oldest statement of Christian belief, still spoken in churches across the world every single week, contain the name of a Roman bureaucrat who held office for 10 years in a distant province? Why is Pontius Pilate the only secular, non-religious figure named in that ancient confession of faith? What does it mean that early Christians chose to anchor the most important event in their entire theology to the name of a specific administrator, a specific moment in time, a specific political decision that could have gone differently, but did not? There are ancient texts about Pilate that most people have never read. There are traditions in African Christianity that place him among the saints. There are legends in Switzerland that say his restless ghost still haunts the mountains near a dark alpine lake. There is a stone, discovered in 1961, that proves his existence beyond any historical doubt. And there is a question at the heart of all of this that history has never fully answered. What did Pontius Pilate really think about the man he condemned? Stay until the end. Because what you will understand then is something that changes not just how you see Pilate, but how you see yourself. The world into which Pontius Pilate was born was a world of extraordinary power and extraordinary anxiety. Rome in the early 1st century was the most dominant political force the Western world had ever seen. It stretched from the rain-soaked forests of northern Britain to the sun-blasted sands of the Sahara. From the Atlantic coast of Spain to the eastern margins of the known world, where the Euphrates River marked the boundary between Roman ambition and Parthian resistance. Within that vast space lived tens of millions of people, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, living under wildly different climates and cultures, united by one thing, the weight of Rome above them all. And yet, for all its power, Rome in the reign of Tiberius was a place of deep unease. Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus had once been a great general, one of the finest military minds Rome had produced in a generation. He had campaigned on the Rhine and the Danube. He had administered provinces with competence and care. But as emperor, something changed in him. He became suspicious, withdrawn, prone to long silences and sudden cruelties. The Roman historian Tacitus would later describe a man who hid his true thoughts behind a wall of ambiguity, who said one thing and meant another, who surrounded himself with people he did not trust, and trusted no one at all. Around the year 26 of the Common Era, Tiberius made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He left Rome. He retreated to the island of Capri, that beautiful rocky outcrop in the Bay of Naples, and he never returned to the capital. He governed the empire from a distance, through letters and messengers, through the men he had placed in positions of authority across the provinces. Men like Pontius Pilate. Who was Pilate before he came to Judea? That question has troubled historians for 2,000 years. We know surprisingly little about his origins. His name tells us something. Pontius is a family name connected to the Samnite region of central Italy, a mountainous area south of Rome whose people had resisted Roman conquest for generations before being absorbed into the empire. Pilatus as a cognomen has been debated endlessly. Some scholars connect it to the Latin word for a soldier armed with a pilum, the heavy javelin of the Roman legions. Others see a connection to the word for a felt hat. Neither explanation is definitive. What we know more clearly is his social rank. Pilate belonged to the equestrian order, the second highest class in Roman society, just below the senatorial aristocracy. The equestrians were the class of administrators, officers, businessmen, men of capital and ambition who lacked the ancient bloodlines of the Senate but who ran the practical machinery of the empire. And there is a connection that historians have discussed for generations, a connection that, if real, explains almost everything about how Pilate got his post and why he lost it. The connection to Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was, in the late years of the reign of Tiberius, the most powerful man in Rome after the emperor himself. He was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit responsible for protecting the emperor. And he used that position to build an influence that touched every corner of the empire. Sejanus was the emperor's closest confidant, his advisor, his gatekeeper. In the years when Tiberius withdrew to Capri, Sejanus became, in practical terms, the man who ran the empire. He had friends everywhere. He had clients everywhere. Men he had placed in positions of power, men who owed their careers to him, men who would act in his interests because their interests were tied to his survival. Was Pilate one of those men? We cannot prove it. The ancient sources do not give us a clear, direct statement connecting them. But the timing fits. Pilate was appointed prefect of Judea in 26 of the Common Era, at the height of Sejanus's power. And Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher who was a contemporary witness, writes explicitly that Sejanus harbored hostility toward the Jewish people. If Pilate was Sejanus's man in Judea, that hostility could explain a great deal of what followed. But all of that is still in the future when Pilate arrives in Judea for the first time. Imagine the journey. From Rome, across the sea, past the Greek islands scattered like stepping stones across the blue Mediterranean. Then south and east, toward the Syrian coast, toward the land that the Romans called Judea, that the Jewish people called the land of Israel, that generations of conquerors had passed through and that none of them had ever truly controlled. Judea was not a comfortable posting. For a Roman official accustomed to the marble and order of the imperial cities, it was a disorienting place. Not primarily because of the climate, though the heat of summer and the dust of the desert were real. Not because of the distance, though it was far from Rome. But because of the people. The Jews of Judea in the first century were unlike any other people the Romans governed. They worshipped a single invisible God. They refused to make images of that God or of any other being. They kept an elaborate system of religious laws that governed what they ate, what they wore, how they rested, how they worked, how they prayed. They had a sacred text that they treated with a reverence that Romans found both admirable and bewildering. And they had a memory. A long, deep, ancient memory of a history in which their God had acted on their behalf. Had freed them from slavery. Had given them a land. Had spoken to them through prophets. And had promised that one day, through a figure they called the Messiah, the Anointed One, the world would be set right and their people would be free. That memory was not passive. It was alive. It was active. It generated movements, prophets, preachers, rebels, seekers. It made Judea one of the most politically and spiritually volatile regions in the entire empire. And it made it one of the hardest places in the world to govern. The administrative capital of the province was not Jerusalem. Though Jerusalem was the religious heart of the land, the city of the temple, the city where the high priest presided over the greatest institution of Jewish life, the actual base of Roman administration was Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea was a stunning city. King Herod the Great, that brilliant, brutal, endlessly ambitious ruler who had governed Judea as a client king of Rome, had built it from almost nothing. On a stretch of coast where there was no natural harbor, he had created one, sinking enormous concrete blocks into the seabed, constructing breakwaters that could shelter entire fleets. Around that harbor he had built a Roman city, wide paved streets, a theater overlooking the sea, an amphitheater, temples, markets, a palace. Caesarea was Rome in miniature, planted in the middle of Jewish land. And in that palace, the same palace that Herod had built for himself and that had since become the official residence of the Roman prefect, Pilate lived and worked. He could see the sea from his windows. That connection to the sea, to the ships that came and went, to the route that led back to Rome, must have felt important during the long months in a land that did not want him there. Jerusalem was different. When Pilate went to Jerusalem, which he did, always, for the great festivals, because the festivals were the times of maximum political danger, he was entering a world that operated by entirely different rules. Jerusalem was not a Roman city wearing a Jewish face. It was a Jewish city that Roman power occupied by force, and that resisted that occupation at every level, from the grand gestures of the priestly aristocracy negotiating with the prefect, to the whispered prayers of the ordinary people in the streets who kept the memory of freedom alive in their hearts. The center of Jerusalem, the center of Jewish life, the center of everything that mattered in this land, was the temple. Not merely a building. Not merely a religious institution. The temple was the place where heaven and earth met, according to Jewish theology. It was the house of the living God. Its great stones, fitted together without mortar, had taken decades to build and generated awe even in those who did not share the faith it embodied. The outer courts could hold tens of thousands of people. The inner sanctuaries were progressively more restricted, more sacred, culminating in the Holy of Holies, the innermost room, which only the high priest could enter, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. The high priest in those years was Joseph Caiaphas. He had held the office since the year 18 of the Common Era. He would hold it until 36. The same decade as Pilate's prefecture. That coincidence was not accidental. Pilate could appoint and remove the high priest. His predecessors had done so with some frequency. The fact that Caiaphas survived throughout Pilate's entire tenure tells us something important: these two men had found a way to work together. Not warmly. Not easily. But productively enough that neither had reason to destroy the other. It was a relationship built entirely on mutual need and mutual risk. Pilate needed Caiaphas to maintain religious order. Without the cooperation of the high priest, without the institutional authority of the temple establishment, governing this intensely religious population would have been nearly impossible. Riots, protests, uprisings, all of these would cost Pilate politically. He needed the temple on his side. Caiaphas needed Pilate to stay in power. Any high priest who lost Roman favor lost his position. And the institution of the high priesthood itself, the temple cult, the entire structure of Jewish religious life in Jerusalem, depended on the tolerance, however grudging, of the Roman power above it. They were not friends. They were two pragmatic men in difficult positions, each holding the other's vulnerability in his hands. Pilate's administration was not peaceful. Almost from the beginning, he created conflicts. The first crisis came early in his tenure. He sent his troops into Jerusalem carrying military standards that bore the image of the Emperor Tiberius. For Roman soldiers this was entirely routine. Standards were standards. The image of the emperor was a symbol of loyalty and imperial authority. For Jewish observers, it was a catastrophe. Jewish law forbade images. The commandment against graven images was not an abstract theological principle, it was a living, daily, fiercely enforced rule. To bring images of a foreign emperor into the holy city was not just an insult. It was a desecration. It was an act of deliberate or ignorant aggression against everything the city represented. A delegation of Jews traveled from Jerusalem to Caesarea to protest. They stood outside Pilate's palace for 5 days. They would not leave. They refused to eat. They simply stood there, day after day, in the dusty heat of the coastal city, making their presence felt. On the 6th day, Pilate lost patience. He summoned them to the amphitheater. They came, thinking he had agreed to hear their case. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by soldiers, armed, positioned for violence. Pilate told them bluntly, "Go home or die." What happened next is one of the most remarkable scenes in all the historical record of this period. The entire crowd fell to the ground. They stretched out their necks. They said, collectively, with a silence louder than any speech, "Then kill us." Pilate looked at them. At these hundreds of men and women lying face down in the dirt of an amphitheater, willing to be slaughtered rather than accept the desecration of their holy city. And he backed down. He ordered the standards removed from Jerusalem. This moment is crucial for understanding who Pilate was. Not the monster that some later traditions painted him. Not the sensitive philosopher that others tried to make him. Something more complicated and more human than either. A calculating man. A pragmatist. A man who pushed until the political cost of pushing became too high, and then stopped. He had calculated, correctly, that massacring a crowd of unarmed civilian religious protesters would generate a political firestorm that would reach all the way to Rome. Tiberius was far away on Capri, but he received reports. And reports of unnecessary massacres were not the kind of thing a prefect who wanted to keep his position needed to generate. But the standards episode was not the only crisis. There was the affair of the temple treasury. Pilate decided to fund the construction of an aqueduct for Jerusalem. An aqueduct was a practical good, the city needed water, the project would improve conditions for the population. But Pilate chose to finance it using the Corban, the sacred funds of the temple treasury, the money that worshippers had donated specifically for the service of God. The outrage was immediate and widespread. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian whose writings are one of our primary sources for this entire period, describes what happened next with a detail that makes the scene viscerally real. Pilate mixed plainclothes soldiers into the crowd of protesters. When the demonstration grew loud and angry, he gave the signal. The soldiers drew hidden clubs and began to beat the crowd. People died. People were injured. The protest ended not with negotiation but with blood in the streets. Josephus records this with the restraint that characterizes his best historical writing. But behind his careful sentences, you can feel the horror of what he is describing. A crowd that came to voice a legitimate grievance. A prefect who responded not with dialogue but with disguised violence. And then there were the golden shields. Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher, a contemporary of these events, one of the finest intellectual minds of his age, describes this episode in his work known as The Embassy to Gaius. Pilate had gilded shields installed in the Herodian palace in Jerusalem. Not images, just shields with the emperor's name inscribed on them. No human face, no figure, just letters. But their placement in that palace, in that holy city, felt to Jewish observers like another calculated provocation. This time, the response bypassed Pilate entirely. The sons of Herod, the tetrarchs who ruled various parts of the region as client kings under Roman supervision, wrote directly to Tiberius. And Tiberius replied personally to Pilate. In a letter that Philo says was filled with reproaches, with sharp language, with the unmistakable tone of a superior dressing down a subordinate who had overstepped. Tiberius ordered the shields removed. Pilate had been publicly humiliated by his own emperor. Called to account not by local protesters but by the master of the world. Think about what that must have felt like. To be an ambitious man in a difficult post, trying to assert Roman authority in a resistant land, and to have the emperor himself tell you that you had gone too far. That you had embarrassed the administration. That your judgment could not be trusted. These three episodes, the standards, the treasury, the shields, paint a consistent portrait. A man who repeatedly provoked conflicts he could not fully control. A man who tested limits and found them. A man who was neither completely reckless nor completely wise, but who governed through a kind of chronic miscalculation that kept the province perpetually on edge. And then, somewhere in those years of tension and friction and fragile coexistence, came a year that would define everything. The year is uncertain. Most scholars say 30 of the Common Era. Some say 33. The exact date has been debated for generations and is unlikely to be resolved definitively. But the event is not uncertain. A man from Galilee was brought before Pontius Pilate. Before we can understand that morning, we need to understand who Jesus of Nazareth was before he stood in Pilate's courtyard. He was not unknown. In Rome, he was completely unknown. Rome had not heard of him. Rome had no interest in itinerant Jewish preachers from the Galilean countryside. But in Judea, in Galilee, in the villages along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, in the synagogues and the marketplaces and the roads of that small, intense, spiritually charged land, he was known. He had been active for roughly 2 or 3 years. He had begun in the north, in Galilee, in the villages and fields and hillsides where the ordinary people of the land lived their ordinary lives. He had gathered followers, a small core of 12 disciples, and a larger circle of supporters that expanded as he moved. He had healed people. He had taught in parables, stories drawn from the agricultural and domestic world of his listeners, stories that said profound things about God and human beings in language that required no philosophical education to understand. He had a way of speaking that unsettled people. Not because he was frightening, though he could be, in the moments when his language grew sharp and prophetic, but because he spoke with an authority that his listeners found unprecedented. The Gospels record the reaction of crowds who heard him. He teaches as one who has authority, not as the scribes. Something in his presence, in his words, in his manner, communicated a directness that bypassed convention. And he spoke of the kingdom of God. Constantly. Obsessively. Everything he said came back to this: the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is near. The kingdom of God belongs to the poor, to the mourning, to the meek, to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. In the context of a people living under foreign military occupation, the phrase, the kingdom of God, was never purely spiritual. It resonated with centuries of prophetic tradition. It echoed the dreams of liberation that lay at the heart of Jewish memory. It pointed toward a different order of things, a world in which God's justice would reign rather than Caesar's power. Whatever Jesus himself meant by it, and the scholars have argued about this for 200 years, the political dimension was impossible to completely avoid. For the high priest Caiaphas and the priestly establishment in Jerusalem, this man from Galilee had become a problem. Not necessarily because they believed he was a political revolutionary. Some of them may have thought he was a sincere but misguided prophet. Some may have genuinely believed his teaching was theologically dangerous. But all of them could see what was happening with the crowds. And Passover was coming. Passover was the most dangerous time of the year from a Roman security perspective, and from the temple establishment's perspective as well. It was the festival that commemorated the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. It filled Jerusalem with pilgrims from across the land and the diaspora. Hundreds of thousands of people crowded into a city whose normal population was a fraction of that. People who were already emotionally and spiritually primed by the story of liberation, by the ritual foods, by the ancient prayers that said, "Once we were slaves. Now we are free." Into that highly charged atmosphere, the presence of a charismatic preacher who spoke about a new kingdom and commanded enormous popular loyalty was a potential spark in a room full of dry wood. Caiaphas was not a cruel man. He was a survivor. A politician of the temple. A man who had lasted longer in that office than almost anyone else in his generation by understanding, with cold precision, what needed to be done. The Gospel of John gives him a line that cuts to the heart of his thinking with terrifying clarity. "It is better for you that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish." That is not cruelty. That is the logic of power. The logic of the man who believes that stability is more important than justice. The logic of the administrator who makes the calculation in the abstract and does not allow himself to look too closely at the human face of the one who must be sacrificed. Caiaphas had decided. Jesus had to die. The arrest came at night. In the Garden of Gethsemane, an olive grove on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, east of the city, across the Kidron Valley. A place that Jesus and his disciples knew well. A place they had come to before. And someone had told the priestly authorities exactly where to find him. Judas Iscariot. One of the 12. One of the men who had walked with Jesus since Galilee, who had eaten with him, listened to him, been trusted by him. He came to the priests and offered, for 30 pieces of silver, to deliver Jesus to them. Why? That question has haunted the human imagination for 2,000 years. Greed? Disappointment that Jesus had not turned out to be the political Messiah that Judas hoped for. A terrible, Misguided attempt to force Jesus to reveal his divine power by putting him in extremis? We don't know. We have never known. The Gospels offer motives but not certainty, and the deeper psychology of Judas Iscariot remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. What we know is what he did. He led the temple guard to the garden. He approached Jesus in the dark among the olive trees. He greeted him with a kiss, the prearranged signal, the sign that said to the soldiers in the shadows, "This is the man." Jesus was arrested. Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of one of the servants of the high priest. Jesus told him to put the sword away. And the disciples fled into the darkness, every one of them, leaving Jesus alone with the soldiers and the torchlight. He was taken first to Annas, the former high priest and father-in-law of Caiaphas, who still held enormous informal power. Then to Caiaphas himself, where a night trial was held, irregular, rushed, conducted in the small hours when the city was sleeping and the streets were empty. Witnesses were produced. Their testimonies contradicted each other. Eventually the question was asked directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered in a way that gave them what they needed. The high priest tore his robes. The ancient gesture of outrage at blasphemy. The verdict came quickly, he deserves death. But the priests had a problem. They had the religious verdict. They had the condemnation of their own court. But the power to execute, the power of life and death over the population, that belonged to Rome. That belonged to the prefect. That belonged to Pontius Pilate. And so, in the earliest light of the morning, before the city was fully awake, a procession moved through the streets of Jerusalem. The priests. The temple guard. And in the middle of them, bound, having been awake all night, having been struck and mocked and humiliated in the house of the high priest, Jesus of Nazareth. They came to the praetorium. The official residence of the Roman prefect when he was in Jerusalem, almost certainly the palace that Herod had built on the western hill of the city. The priests did not enter. To enter a Gentile building during Passover week would have made them ritually impure, would have prevented them from eating the Passover meal. The bitter irony writes itself, they had come to arrange a man's death, and they were concerned about their ritual purity. So Pilate came to them. He came out. He stood above them on the steps or the platform, in the early morning light, and he looked down at the crowd. At the priests in their robes. At the temple guard with their weapons. At the bound man standing among them. What did he see? A provincial religious dispute that had somehow become his problem before breakfast. An inconvenient complication on the most politically sensitive week of his calendar year. A man who had apparently upset the temple establishment badly enough that they had dragged him here at dawn demanding a death sentence. He asked the question that Roman procedure required, "What is the accusation?" The priest's answer was evasive. "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have brought him to you." That was not an accusation. That was political pressure. Pilate recognized it. And something in him, something we cannot fully explain, something that makes this story endlessly fascinating to every generation that encounters it, pushed back. He had Jesus brought inside. Alone. Away from the priests, away from the crowd. The Gospel of John gives us this private conversation in a form that reads, 2,000 years later, with an almost unbearable intensity. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered with a question, "Do you say this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" It's a strange response. It turns the interrogation around. It makes Pilate a participant in the conversation rather than simply its master. Pilate replied, with what sounds like genuine irritation, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate heard that. He processed it. He said, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And then Pilate said something that has been repeated, analyzed, argued over, and wondered about for 2,000 years. He said, "What is truth? Quid est veritas?" And he went out again without waiting for an answer. What did he mean by that? Some scholars read it as pure cynicism. The hardened bureaucrat who has spent a career making practical decisions, dismissing the very concept of objective truth as a luxury of philosophers and dreamers. What is truth? Nothing. What exists is power, and position, and the calculation of what needs to be done to survive. Others read it as a genuine moment of philosophical crisis. A man who, in conversation with this unusual prisoner, has suddenly felt the limits of his own worldview. Who has touched something he cannot name and cannot process and cannot fit into any category he possesses. Perhaps both readings are true. Perhaps neither is. Perhaps it was simply impatience. A man with a political problem, surrounded by an angry crowd, before he has eaten breakfast, asking a rhetorical question he never expected to have answered. What we know is that he went back to the priests and said, "I find no guilt in this man." He found no guilt. That statement is extraordinary. It is the verdict of the judge. It is the conclusion of the official Roman legal process. The man who had been brought to Pilate as a criminal, a troublemaker, a threat to public order, the judge who heard the case found no guilt. And yet, Pilate tried to find a way out. He tried the Passover custom, if it was a custom, of releasing one prisoner to the crowd as a gesture of goodwill. He offered the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a man actually imprisoned for insurrection and murder. A real rebel. A genuine threat to Roman order, exactly the kind of person that Roman law was designed to deal with. The crowd chose Barabbas. Then Pilate had Jesus flogged. It was a brutal punishment. The condemned man was bound to a post, and soldiers beat him with a whip whose leather straps were loaded with bone fragments or metal pieces. The skin tore. The flesh opened. People sometimes barely survived the flogging alone. Pilate may have hoped this would be enough. That the sight of a beaten, humiliated, bloodied man would satisfy whatever it was the priests needed satisfied. The soldiers took it further. They wove a crown from thorny branches and pressed it onto his head. They threw a purple robe over his shoulders, the color of kings and emperors. They knelt before him in mockery, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him. Pilate brought Jesus back out before the crowd. He said those words that the Gospel of John has preserved, words that stand like a sculpture in the middle of the narrative, "Ecce homo." Behold the man. What did he mean? Was it a last appeal to the crowd's compassion? Look at this beaten, broken, bleeding human being, is this not enough? Was it resignation? Here he is, I have done what I can do. Was it something deeper, some wordless recognition of an ordinary human being reduced to his most elemental state? We don't know. We will never know. What we know is what happened next. The priests responded, "Crucify him. Crucify him." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." And the priest said, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." The Gospel of John records what followed with a precision that has fascinated readers for 2 millennia. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. More afraid. He had already been uneasy. Now he was more afraid. He went back inside. He asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said, "You will not speak to me? Don't you know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus said, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment, the Gospel says, Pilate sought to release him. He was trying. Genuinely trying. Something in this conversation, something in this prisoner, had gotten under his skin in a way that no amount of pragmatic calculation could fully suppress. And then came the sentence that ended all of it. The priests called out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Not Caesar's friend. Amicus Caesaris." That was not a casual phrase. In the political vocabulary of the Roman Empire, it was almost a title. The friends of Caesar were the inner circle, the trusted allies, the men who had the emperor's favor and protection. To lose that status, to be identified as someone who was not Caesar's friend, was political death. In the paranoid atmosphere of the late Tiberius years, it could mean literal death as well. Pilate understood exactly what was being said. And there is something we need to understand about Pilate's position in this specific moment of this specific year. Sejanus was dead. In 31 of the Common Era, just a few years before this morning, if the year of the crucifixion was 33, or just a year or two before if it was 30, Tiberius had turned on his most trusted ally. Had Sejanus arrested, tried, and executed. Along with his family. Along with his associates. Along with anyone whose fortunes had been tied to his. If Pilate had been Sejanus's man, and the evidence, though circumstantial, suggests he was, then he was already politically vulnerable. Already under scrutiny. Already one bad report away from being recalled to Rome to answer uncomfortable questions. The priests knew this. Or at least they knew how to use the language of imperial loyalty as a weapon. "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Pilate heard those words. He sat down on the judgment seat. The official seat of Roman legal authority. He said, "Behold your king." They said, away with him, crucify him." He said, "Shall I crucify your king?" They answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And then, in the Gospel of Matthew, there is a scene that is found nowhere else in the ancient sources. A scene of peculiar, haunting, impossible to forget symbolism. Pilate called for water. He washed his hands before the crowd. He said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." A Roman man. Using a Jewish ritual gesture. At the moment of the most consequential decision of his life. The hand-washing as a symbol of innocence appears in Jewish scripture, in the Psalms, in the ritual of the elders when a murdered man is found in the countryside and no one knows who killed him. They wash their hands and say, "Our hands did not shed this blood." Pilate knew this gesture. Or Pilate used this gesture. Whether he knew its specific Jewish context or was simply enacting a universal human impulse, the impulse to put physical distance between oneself and a terrible act, we cannot say. What we can say is that the gesture failed. Because immediately after washing his hands, he pronounced the sentence. He handed Jesus over to be crucified. The hands that had just been washed signed the death warrant. The symbolic act of innocence preceded the actual act of condemnation by seconds. That is the paradox at the center of everything about Pontius Pilate. That is what makes him unforgettable. That is what makes him the only secular figure in the Apostles' Creed. Not his power. Not his cruelty. But that gap, that terrible, human, recognizable gap, between what he knew and what he did. The crucifixion that followed was Roman execution at its most methodical. Jesus was led out, or rather, forced to carry the crossbeam of his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of execution. His name, his crime, his identity, was written on a placard that would be nailed above him. Pilate himself dictated the wording, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, so that every person who passed would be able to read it. The priests objected. "Don't write King of the Jews," they said. "Write that he claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate said, "What I have written, I have written." It was perhaps the only decisive thing he said that entire morning. And it was, in its own way, an act of stubbornness that looked like defiance without being courage. He would not change the sign. But he had already signed the order. The place of execution was called Golgotha, the skull place. A rocky outcropping outside the city walls, a public, visible location where executions were meant to serve as warnings. The execution itself took several hours. Crucifixion was one of the most deliberately prolonged and painful methods of execution that the ancient world had devised. The Romans used it specifically for the categories of people they most wanted to humiliate and intimidate: slaves, non-citizens, rebels, those who had challenged imperial authority. It was a message written in suffering. It said, "This is what happens to those who resist." At around the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, Jesus died. The death was faster than expected. Crucified men typically survived for days. The flogging, the blood loss, the physical trauma of that morning had shortened his endurance. A soldier tested for death by thrusting a spear into his side. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council who had quietly sympathized with Jesus, came to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate paused. He sent for the centurion who had been at the execution. He asked, "Is he already dead?" The centurion confirmed it. Pilate released the body. A small administrative act. Possibly the most human moment of his entire involvement in this story. A man asking, "Is he dead?" and being satisfied with the answer. Jesus was taken down from the cross and buried in a rock-cut tomb in a garden near the place of execution. Joseph sealed it with a large stone. And then the Sabbath began, and Jerusalem rested. The next day, the Sabbath itself, the priests came back to Pilate. They had an unusual request. Jesus had said he would rise again after 3 days. They wanted the tomb guarded, so that his disciples could not steal the body and claim a resurrection had occurred. Pilate said, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you can." Soldiers were posted. The tomb was sealed. And then, on the morning of the first day of the week, on what Christians call Easter Sunday, the women who came to anoint the body found the tomb open. Empty. The burial cloths lying in the stone chamber, but the body gone. What happened in that tomb, historical inquiry cannot determine. Historians cannot prove the resurrection. That lies in the domain of faith, not evidence. But historians can note this: the earliest opponents of the Jesus movement never argued that the tomb was still occupied. They argued that the disciples had stolen the body. But they conceded the fact of the empty tomb. Whatever occurred in that garden on that morning, the tomb was empty. And the movement that began in that emptiness spread with a speed and a reach that surprised everyone, including, almost certainly, Pontius Pilate. What did Pilate think in the days and weeks and months that followed? The sources go almost completely silent on him. He governed. The province was administered. The festivals came and went. The taxes were collected. The reports were filed. But somewhere in the roads of Judea, in the upper rooms of Jerusalem, in the synagogues and fishing villages of Galilee, a community was forming. A community that gathered around the memory and the presence of the man Pilate had crucified. A community that told stories. That performed baptisms. That shared meals in remembrance. That grew, week by week, quietly and persistently. The stories they told reached everywhere. They must have reached Pilate. And here is where we enter the territory of the texts that most people have never encountered. The texts that fill the silence the canonical Gospels left around Pilate's subsequent life. The texts that tell us how the early Christians remembered him, imagined him, argued about him, and sometimes, remarkably, tried to redeem him. The Acta Pilati, known in later tradition as the Gospel of Nicodemus, is one of the most significant of these. It is an apocryphal text. That means it was not included in the official canon of the New Testament when that canon was defined in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But it circulated widely in the early centuries of the Church. It was read in communities across the Mediterranean world. Versions of it survived in Greek and Latin and Syriac and Coptic and Armenian. The text presents itself as an official record of the trial of Jesus, the actual written minutes of the legal proceedings, preserved for posterity. It is not historically reliable in the sense of giving us accurate factual information about what happened. Scholars are confident it was composed several centuries after the events it describes. But it is historically fascinating because it shows us how the early church thought about Pilate. How they processed his role. What they needed him to mean. In the Acta Pilati, Pilate is a man genuinely struggling with justice. He conducts a thorough examination. He summons witnesses. He cross-examines the accusers with pointed questions. He defends Jesus against false testimony. He is clearly reluctant to condemn and does everything within his power, or at least within the power that the narrative allows him, to find a way to free him. Why did early Christians portray Pilate this way? Partly for theological reasons. It was important to establish that even the representative of Rome, even the pagan official with the authority of the greatest empire in the world, recognized the innocence of Jesus. The condemnation was not Rome's fault. It was the fault of the religious establishment that demanded the verdict. This had political utility too. The early Christians lived in the Roman Empire. They needed the empire to tolerate them, eventually to accept them. A narrative in which Rome was not responsible for the death of Jesus helped those negotiations. But there is something else in the Acta Pilati, something more psychologically interesting. There is a portrait of a man trapped between what he knows and what he does. Trapped between justice and survival. Trapped in exactly the same place that the canonical Gospels put him. The Acta Pilati did not invent Pilate's dilemma. It elaborated it, expanded it, made it central rather than peripheral. Because something about that dilemma resonated. It resonated then. It resonates now. There is the Tertullian tradition to consider. Tertullian was a North African theologian writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. He was one of the most brilliant and combative minds in the early church. And he made a claim about Pilate that has fascinated scholars ever since. He claimed that Pilate sent a report to Tiberius after the crucifixion, a report about Jesus, about his life and death and the subsequent reports of his resurrection, and that Tiberius, after reading it, actually proposed to the Roman Senate that Jesus should be recognized as a god. The Senate refused. But Tiberius, according to Tertullian, threatened those who persecuted Christians. Most scholars regard this as a later Christian legend, a pious elaboration designed to claim imperial sympathy for the new faith at the highest possible level. The story of Tiberius proposing to deify Jesus is almost certainly not historical. But underneath the legend lies a question that is entirely reasonable. Did Pilate file a report about Jesus? In the Roman Empire of the 1st century, provincial governors were expected to report significant events to the emperor. Uprisings, executions of notable figures, religious disturbances, all of these were the kinds of things that went into the regular dispatches that flowed from the provinces to Rome. Jesus was a public figure. His execution was a public event. The subsequent disturbance, the stories of the empty tomb, the rapid growth of a movement around his memory, were exactly the kinds of things that a diligent administrator should have reported. It is not just plausible. It is likely. And if that report existed, if Pilate wrote, in the dry language of Roman bureaucracy, about the unusual prisoner he had examined, about the political pressure that had driven his decision, about the empty tomb and the spreading rumors, then it went to Rome. It was filed. It sat in the imperial archives. And then it was lost. Or destroyed. Or buried so deep in the labyrinthine record-keeping of a vast empire that it has never been found. The versions of Pilate's letter that circulated in early Christian communities, various texts purporting to be the official report he sent to Rome, are almost certainly later forgeries. Their language, their theology, their concerns, all betray their origins as later Christian compositions rather than genuine imperial documents. But forgeries are made to fill a genuine absence. People forge letters when they believe a real letter should exist and does not. The early Christians forged Pilate's report to Rome because they were convinced, not without reason, that such a report had existed and been lost. And they needed it. They needed the testimony of the man who had been there. The man who had looked Jesus in the eye. The man who had said, in his official judicial capacity, I find no guilt in this man. That testimony would have been the most powerful single document in the defense of the Christian faith. And it is gone. But there is something that is not gone. In 1961, Italian archaeologists were excavating the ruins of the ancient theater at Caesarea Maritima, the city where Pilate had lived and governed. In the excavation, they found a stone. A block of limestone, roughly 82 centimeters by 65 centimeters, that had been repurposed as a building material in later construction. The stone was damaged. Pieces were missing. The surface was worn by time. But 4 lines of Latin text were still legible. Reconstructed, the inscription reads, "To the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated." A dedication stone for a building, almost certainly a Tiberium, a structure honoring the Emperor Tiberius, built or commissioned by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. That stone is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It is called the Pilate stone. It is small, unassuming, easy to walk past in a museum without fully registering what you are looking at. But what it represents is enormous. Before 1961, the historical existence of Pontius Pilate rested entirely on literary sources. The Gospels, Josephus, Tacitus, Philo. All texts. All documents produced by human hands with human purposes and human perspectives and human biases. After 1961, Pilate's existence was confirmed in stone. Literally. Here was his name. His title. His rank. Carved into limestone by someone who had worked for him, or under orders from him, in the very city where he had lived and governed. The Pilate stone changed the historical conversation. It also confirmed something that had puzzled scholars for a long time. Tacitus, in his Annals, calls Pilate a procurator, procurator being a title used for provincial administrators. But the Pilate stone calls him prefectus, prefect. The difference is significant. A prefect was a military officer as well as a civilian administrator. A procurator was more purely a financial and administrative role. Scholars now understand that Tacitus used the title that was current in his own time, the late 1st and early 2nd century, when procurator had become the standard designation for administrators of that rank. Pilate's actual title, during his actual time in office, was prefect. A detail. A small technical detail of Roman administrative history. But it matters because it shows how careful we have to be with ancient sources. Even reliable ancient sources. Even Tacitus, one of the finest historians the ancient world produced, can be misleading in small ways. The Pilate stone corrected the record. Tacitus himself gives us another extraordinary confirmation, in a different passage. In his Annals, writing about Nero's persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 of the Common Era, he provides a brief historical note that has been analyzed by scholars for centuries. He writes that the Christians got their name from Christ, who had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate, and that this deadly superstition had been temporarily suppressed, but was breaking out again not only in Judea, its original home, but even in Rome itself. This is not a Christian source. Tacitus had no sympathy for Christianity. He called it a destructive superstition. He wrote about it because he was explaining why Nero blamed the Christians for the fire. And in passing, incidentally, as background information that his readers already knew or could be expected to know, he mentions the execution of Jesus under Pilate as a historical fact. Not a theological claim. Not a matter of faith. A historical data point that the Roman historical record considered established. That is significant. It means the execution of Jesus under Pilate was known beyond Christian circles. Known in Rome. Known in the broader Mediterranean world. Known well enough that one of Rome's most distinguished historians could mention it in passing without explanation. Flavius Josephus gives us more. The passage in his Jewish antiquities known as the Testimonium Flavianum is one of the most debated texts in all of ancient historical scholarship. In its current form, it reads with a theological enthusiasm that cannot plausibly have come from a Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience. Scholars have concluded that Christian copyists added material to the original Josephine text, inserting phrases that Josephus himself would never have written. But most scholars believe there is a core of original Josephine text underneath the Christian editions. And that core, stripped of the later insertions, says something like, "There was a man named Jesus, and Pilate condemned him to the cross at the instigation of the leading men among us." At the instigation of the leading men among us. That phrase comes from Josephus, not from a Christian editor. It is the voice of a Jewish historian acknowledging, with a certain complicated emotion, that the Jewish establishment had a role in what happened. These sources, the Gospels, Josephus, Tacitus, Philo, and the Pilate stone, together constitute a historical picture of unusual solidity for events of this period. The picture they paint is of a real man, in a real place, making a real decision, with real consequences that turned out to be unimaginably vast. And what happened to that real man after his decision? Pilate governed for another 6 years after the crucifixion. And then came the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a people who lived in the region between Judea and Galilee, related to but distinct from the Jews, with their own religious traditions and their own holy mountain, Mount Gerizim. Around the year 36, a Samaritan prophet began assembling followers on Mount Gerizim, promising to reveal sacred objects that Moses had hidden there. It was a religious pilgrimage. A gathering of the faithful. Pilate sent in the cavalry. He massacred the crowd. He arrested the leaders. He executed them. The Samaritans appealed to Lucius Vitellius, the legate of Syria, the highest Roman official in the region. Vitellius investigated. He concluded that Pilate had acted with excessive and unjustified force. He ordered Pilate to go to Rome and answer to the emperor for his conduct. Pilate left Judea. He made the voyage to Rome. But before he arrived, Tiberius died. In March of 37 of the Common Era, on Capri, the emperor breathed his last. The man Pilate had needed to answer to was gone. The new emperor was Caligula. What Caligula decided to do with Pilate, the ancient sources do not tell us. And that silence, that historical silence about the end of Pilate's life, has been filled, for 2,000 years, by legend. Eusebius of Caesarea, the great church historian writing in the early 4th century, records a tradition that Pilate fell into great misfortune under Caligula. That he was forced to commit suicide. Eusebius presents this as divine justice. The man who condemned the innocent Christ met a wretched end. This tradition may be accurate. It may be an elaboration of a kernel of historical fact, or it may be a theological narrative imposed on a historical blank. There is another tradition, preserved in various medieval sources, that says Pilate was sent into exile in Gaul, in the region of what is now southern France, near the city of Vienne. There, according to this tradition, he lived in growing despair and eventually took his own life, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had done. And then there is the legend of the Pilatus mountain in central Switzerland. Near the city of Lucerne, there rises a dark, brooding peak often wreathed in cloud and mist. For centuries it has been called Mount Pilatus. One tradition says the name comes from the Latin word pileatus, meaning cloud-covered. But another tradition says something different. It says that the body of Pontius Pilate was brought to this mountain, or that his ghost came here, and that in the lake near its summit, his restless spirit is condemned to repeat, forever, the gesture of washing his hands. Condemned to perform the ritual of innocence for eternity, because innocence could not be achieved by that ritual. Because the hands never became clean. That legend is not history. But it is profound in the way that legends are sometimes more profound than history. It captures something that the historical record cannot quite hold, the psychological reality of a man who did what his conscience told him was wrong, performed a ritual to separate himself from the act, and found, as every human being finds who has tried this, that the ritual changed nothing. The water was clean. The hands remained what they were. There is one more tradition about Pilate that deserves attention, one that is almost completely unknown outside the specific Christian communities that have preserved it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church venerates Pontius Pilate as a saint. The feast day of Saint Pontius Pilate is June 25. The Ethiopian tradition holds that after the resurrection, Pilate was profoundly shaken by what he had witnessed and what he had set in motion. That he came eventually to believe in the resurrection. That he became a follower of the one he had condemned. And that he died as a martyr for that faith. This is not historical. No serious historian defends it as fact. But it exists. It has existed for centuries in one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world. And it points toward something real, not about Pilate, but about the human need to find redemption in even the most compromised figures of history. If Pilate could be redeemed, what does that mean for everyone else? And then there is Claudia, his wife. The Gospel of Matthew, in a detail found nowhere else in the Gospel tradition, mentions her in a single sentence. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." His wife. Her dream. Her warning. She is given no name in the canonical text. The tradition calls her Claudia Procula. Some ancient sources identify her as a granddaughter of Augustus, which would explain how she came to be married to a man of equestrian rank serving in a provincial posting. She dreamed about Jesus. She suffered because of the dream. She sent a message to her husband, in the middle of a formal legal proceeding, urging him to protect a man she had never met. What was the dream? The text does not say. But she reached out. She tried to intervene. She put her concern into the formal arena of her husband's official duties, breaking the protocol that kept women's voices out of the public sphere of Roman administrative life. Pilate received the message. And did nothing with it. In the Ethiopian and Coptic traditions, Claudia Procula is also a saint. She is celebrated as a woman who perceived the truth, who tried to prevent an injustice, and who subsequently became one of the first believers in her household. The woman who warned the man who condemned Jesus, becoming a follower of the one her husband condemned. If there is a human story more wrenchingly ironic than that, it is hard to find. Now we come to the thing that has made Pontius Pilate immortal in a way that no amount of power or position could have achieved. The Apostles' Creed. It is one of the oldest formal statements of Christian belief. Its roots go back to the 2nd century, though its present form took shape over several centuries. It is spoken every Sunday in Catholic churches, in many Protestant churches, in Anglican and Lutheran and Orthodox communities, across the entire geographic spread of Christianity. And every time it is spoken, it contains these words: He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. Pontius Pilate. In the Creed. By name. The only secular, historical, non-divine figure in the entire confession of faith. Not Caesar Augustus, though Jesus was born during his reign. Not Herod the Great, though he slaughtered the innocents according to Matthew's Gospel. Not Caiaphas, though the high priest played the most direct role in arranging the arrest and trial. Not Herod Antipas, who killed John the Baptist. Pontius Pilate. The man who said I find no guilt in him and then ordered the execution. Why him? Why his name? Why this specific, mediocre, politically compromised, historically ambiguous Roman administrator? Because the early Christians needed the events they were describing to be real. Not mythological. Not symbolic. Not a timeless spiritual drama played out in a sacred realm above and beyond history. Real. Datable. Locatable. Verifiable. The name of Pontius Pilate, in the Creed, is a timestamp. It says, this happened in history. In a specific decade. Under a specific administration. When this particular man was the Roman prefect of this particular province. It is an anchor to time. An insistence on historicity. A declaration that the central events of the Christian faith are not fairy tales set in an indefinite once upon a time, but things that happened in the historical world, under a governor whose appointment can be traced, whose conflicts can be documented, whose existence is carved in stone in a museum in Jerusalem. By putting Pilate's name in the creed, the early Christians made him, paradoxically, the guarantor of their story's truthfulness. He wanted to be a footnote. He wanted to be a provincial administrator who did his job and was forgotten when his term ended. Instead, his name has been spoken aloud, in every language of the world in which Christian communities have gathered, every week, for nearly 2,000 years. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. Suffered under. Not because of. Not due to. Under. Under his authority. Under his jurisdiction. Under the power that had been given him, from above. Even the preposition carries weight. And this is the final thing to understand about Pontius Pilate. He is in the creed not because he was important. Not because he was good or wise or just. Not because he made the right decision. He is in the creed because he made the wrong one. And he knew it when he made it. That is what sets him apart from the ordinary run of historical villains. That is what makes him a figure who continues to be examined, argued about, wondered over, 2,000 years after he walked out of that courtroom. He knew. He said it himself. I find no guilt in this man. 3 times, the Gospels record him trying to release Jesus. 3 times the political pressure increased. And at the end, he capitulated. Not because he was persuaded that Jesus was guilty. He never believed that. He capitulated because he was afraid. Because the calculation of political survival outweighed the demand of justice. Because he was, in the end, a man of the system, and the system required this outcome. The water and the basin were his attempt to separate himself from what he was about to do. It didn't work. It never works. The moment you make the wrong decision, the moment you let an innocent person suffer because the cost of protecting them is too high, the moment you put political survival above simple human justice, no amount of hand-washing changes anything. Pilate knew this. On some level, he must have known this. That is why the legends imagined him in exile, sleepless, walking to the edge of a cliff above an alpine lake. That is why the Ethiopian tradition needed to redeem him. That is why the Acta Pilati constructed an elaborate portrait of a man doing everything possible to avoid the inevitable. These traditions, for all their historical unreliability, are psychologically true. They are telling us what the human imagination insists must have been true, that a man who did what Pilate did, knowing what he knew, could not have been at peace with it afterward. The stone of Caesarea says he existed. The Gospels say what he did. The Creed says his name. And the silence of history after he left Judea says everything else. He left for Rome to answer for a massacre of Samaritans. He had spent 10 years provoking conflicts, backing down from some, escalating others, and always calculating. Always measuring the cost of action against the cost of inaction, always choosing the option that seemed safest for his position and his future. Until the one morning when the calculation seemed clearest of all, and he made the decision that would mean his name was never forgotten. Not the name of the emperor he served. Not the name of the high priest who pressured him. Not the name of the soldiers who carried out the execution. His name. Because he had the power. That is the final, terrible, clarifying truth about Pontius Pilate. He had the power to say no. In that entire story, the arrest, the night trial, the morning procession, the crowd, the priests, the threat about Caesar's friendship, Pilate was the only person in the room who genuinely had the legal authority to stop what was happening. The priests needed his agreement. The crowd could not act without his order. The soldiers would do what he commanded. He had the power. And he used it. He used it to do the thing he believed was wrong. That is why the water didn't clean the hands. Not because of any supernatural intervention, not because of divine punishment, but because of something much simpler and much more devastating. You cannot wash away a decision. You can only live with it. Pontius Pilate lived with his decision for whatever years remained to him, in Rome, in exile, in whatever obscurity swallowed the rest of his life. And the movement he had tried to extinguish by eliminating its leader spread faster after the execution than it had before. And the man whose death he had ordered was worshipped as God within a generation. And the empire that had employed him eventually adopted that worship as its official religion. And the words he had spoken, "I find no guilt in this man," were remembered and recorded and read aloud for 2,000 years. He found no guilt. And condemned him anyway. That is the testimony. That is the lost testimony that was never really lost, because it was written into the oldest confession of the faith that grew from that morning. Not written on papyrus. Not filed in an imperial archive. Written in the gap between what Pilate said and what Pilate did. Written in the space between his conscience and his fear. Written in water. On hands that never became clean. Every generation reads that testimony and recognizes something. Something about the way power works. Something about the way fear works. Something about the gap between knowing what is right and doing what is safe. Pilate is in the creed not to be condemned. He is in the creed to be recognized. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. Under a man who knew better. Under a man who washed his hands. Under a man exactly like us.